Let me tell you a short story. There was once a man who had fallen gravely ill after eating a meal. The experience disturbed him deeply, and from that day on he became obsessed with sterilizing his food. He washed and scrubbed everything he ate, determined never to fall sick again. In time, this obsession grew into a mission. He made it his purpose to protect the town. He couldn't bear the thought of anyone else suffering as he had. He went from door to door, pleading with the people to sterilize their food. At first, the townsfolk were unsure, but the man's sincerity and the fear in his voice moved them. Gradually, they were swayed. The town became fixated on cleaning their food, determined to remove every impurity. But after some time, something strange began to happen. The people, once strong and vibrant, began to grow weak. Illness spread. Confusion turned to panic. They didn't understand. And so they reasoned, we must not be cleaning thoroughly enough. The town imposed stricter and stricter codes of sterilization. They scrubbed and cleaned with greater urgency. People began to blame one another. Suspicion grew. Neighbors accused neighbors of not following the code. Punishments were introduced for anyone who disobeyed the rules. Then one day, the man saw something unusual. A small group of people living on the outskirts of town. They were laughing, full of life, healthy. Curious, he watched them. He saw that they weren't following the code. They only rinsed their food slightly before eating it. Outraged, the man approached them. You're watching Archetypal Wisdom. Join me in exploring the symbolic truths and mysteries of humankind. Remember to like and subscribe. Now, back to the video. How dare you ignore the code, he shouted. Can't you see the town is sick? The small group looked at him gently. But don't you see, they said. We are not sick. The man faltered. How is that possible? You're starving your inner ecosystem, they replied. In trying to avoid illness, you've removed the very life your body needs to stay well. Some bacteria are harmful, yes, but without any at all, the body forgets how to live. The man stood in silence. He wanted to report them, but he couldn't deny what he was seeing. They smiled and said, sit, eat with us, stay for a while. And so the man stayed. At first his body protested. Discomfort stirred in his stomach, but they reassured him, be patient. And slowly the discomfort passed. Within a few days the man felt his strength returning. Color returned to his face, vitality flowed through him. He ran back to the town and told the people what he had learned. They were skeptical, but they saw the change in him. One by one they began to listen. Slowly the codes were set aside. People returned to the soil, to the garden, to the balance of life and death. And in time, the town grew healthy again. Not through fear, but through harmony. What do we do with that which we feel is bad? What happens when all we can tolerate is only what we personally feel is good? This can lead to a type of moral superiority, much like the townspeople who believed they were protecting their health by scrubbing away every impurity. Their certainty blinded them to the harm they were causing, not just to their bodies, but to the community itself. Moral superiority can take many forms, but the essential manifestation is certainty of one's own sense of being right, good, and better than. A deep conviction that they are on the good side only. Just like the townsfolk who were convinced sterilization was the only solution and punished anyone who didn't follow the rules. This pattern of moral superiority has persisted across human history, whether in religious or secular domains, with disturbing outcomes. For example, the genocidal horrors of the Crusades and World War II. In our modern times, we see this moral superiority playing out across the cultural and political stage. There are many who believe that their political or cultural stance is the only right stance, or is inherently good and the other is inherently bad. Over and over again, we continue to see this extremity of thought and one-sidedness. So what is driving this moral superiority? Well, it seems in part, the certainty associated with it signifies a primal security. In order to survive, our ancestors had to be certain of their terrain, certain of what is safe and not safe, as it was the difference between life and death. In other words, we are hardwired to cling to that which we are certain of as a matter of survival. Just as the man in the story believes that extreme sterilizing is a matter of life and death. Yet this survival function appears to map onto our psychological personality also. That which the individual is conscious of is what they are certain of, and there is a safety and familiarity with that. On the other hand, the unconscious aspects of an individual are often avoided with great intensity. Well, it is this avoidance that leaves one far more susceptible to projecting the parts of themselves they cannot accept onto others, which is the basic premise of shadow projection. This influences every aspect of one's life. That which they fear or can't accept within themselves is not only projected, but rejected in the world and often warred against. This pattern creates a cycle of pain and dysfunction across humanity. That which is feared and rejected internally is attacked externally, further compelling the compulsion to repress those traits internally, and the cycle goes on. This isn't to make light of good and evil as real forces in the world, but it opens up the question, what are they exactly, and how do we relate to them? Well, in an attempt to answer this question, I want to reference a particularly striking line from John 18:11, in which the betrayal of Christ has begun. As the men arrive to seize Jesus, Simon Peter draws his sword and strikes the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. In that moment of chaos, Christ stops Peter and says, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" What is so fascinating about this line to me is that Christ is essentially saying that this is God's will, and despite the pain that will ensue, he knows that it will eventually lead to the goodness of God's will. It seems to be speaking to a radical acceptance and faith. Well, this certainly opens up a paradoxical idea when it comes to good and evil. Some of the traditional Christian conceptions of good and evil have them severely divided, locked into a timeless battle. Yet to me, this line from Christ indicates the profound nuance and complexity of the big picture. If we look at the story of Christ symbolically, the betrayal and crucifixion is one of the greatest examples of evil, insofar as the worst possible end comes to the best possible person. Yet Christ himself embraces this moment, which appears evil, as a part of God's will, knowing it will eventually lead to transformation and redemption, and the glory of goodness will prevail. The radical implication here is that evil actually has its place in the great tapestry of life, not to be glorified, but to be weaved into the total picture, like shade highlighting the brilliance of the light. So what does this mean exactly? Well, it seems to indicate radical courage. What would happen if we had total acceptance and faith, even in the face of terrible pain and evil? Well, this radical acceptance and openness towards the external world would also inherently invite radical openness and acceptance towards the internal world. Psychologically speaking, this is the idea of shadow integration. We open ourselves up to that which scares and disturbs us, and it gets appropriately utilized. In other words, that which we deem unacceptable and bad becomes accepted and repurposed in a positive way. The so-called dark gets brought into the light. The repressed unconscious aspects get brought under conscious control. The longer something remains repressed, the more it festers and builds energy and tension, which is then going to eventually erupt and lead to genuine dysfunction behaviorally. But if that is brought instead under conscious awareness and integrated, it can be metabolized, so to speak. So how can you do this? Well, the next time you notice yourself judging something intensely or resisting something intensely, become curious of whatever that is. Ask yourself, what is it I hate about this? Once you identify the trait, ask yourself, what is the positive twin of this trait? For example, say you notice that you couldn't stand it when someone was opinionated and obnoxious. Well, the positive twin of this would be confident and forthright. This will give you a clue about the tension you are carrying around a certain trait which has been repressed. Hence why it bothers you so much, and therefore reveals what is yet to be integrated into your conscious self. In this way, the cup given to us by the Father, the pain, the discomfort, the things we had rather avoid, becomes not a curse but an opportunity. It is through embracing the tension between what we see as good and what we fear as bad that we become whole. Just as the townspeople needed to reclaim the life within the soil, the bacteria they once believed was harmful, we too need to reclaim the disowned parts of ourselves. The shadow traits we resist may, if brought into the light and appropriately integrated, nourish us. This is not an easy path. To drink the cup is to accept suffering, to face what terrifies us, to allow the bad a place within the great tapestry of life, not to glorify it, but to transform it. So I leave you with this question. What cup have you been refusing to drink? What part of yourself or the world have you been scrubbing so clean that you've lost the vitality it once offered? Perhaps redemption lies not in rejecting what we fear, but in sitting with it, breaking bread with it, and letting it become the soil from which a fuller self can grow. You've been watching Archetypal Wisdom. Remember to like and subscribe. Stay wise.